Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second webinar in partnership with the Allies for Youth Connections Conference and Sexual Exploitation Week and the Sexual Exploitation Working Group. This webinar, Rescue, Recover, Empower, a Global Perspective on Sexual Exploitation by the Preda Foundation. I would like to start today with a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that we are presenting here virtually from Alberta, 100% of which is on treaty lands. Treaties 6, 7, 8, 4, and 10 and Métis settlements cover all Alberta, where generations of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit have deep connection and call home since time immemorial. We'd like to acknowledge and honor all the elders of this land, past, present, future, and all creation. This webinar will contain information about the sexual exploitation of children and young people. While the topic is challenging and disturbing, it could also be upsetting and perhaps triggering for some. We encourage you to talk to your colleagues and have a way to debrief the webinar or to connect with people who can suggest further therapeutic support. This webinar is a collaborative presentation between the Allies for Youth Connections Conference and the Edmonton Sexual Exploitation Working Group, and brought to you as part of the Sexual Exploitation Week of Awareness. Presenting today is Father Shay Cullen and Francis Bermedo from the Preda Foundation. Today's presentation will provide a global context on the issue of human trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation, including insight into the current situation in Southeast Asia and the legal implications associated with human trafficking, sexual exploitation, and the sex tourism industry, as well as crimes perpetuated through the internet. This will include the evolution of laws in countries around the world aimed at fighting these crimes and bringing social justice to those impacted. An overview will be provided as to the ongoing work of the Preda Foundation, highlighting many innovative initiatives. The webinar will wrap up with comments by Kate Quinn, the Executive Director of the Centre to End All Sexual Exploitation, CEASE, in Edmonton, Alberta. Kate will ground her presentation in a Canadian context.
Yes, welcome everybody. I'm going to introduce the presenters for the webinar. Father Shay Cullen is an internationally known advocate and humanitarian, helping the voiceless to have a voice. Father Shay is a missionary priest from Ireland and a member of the Missionary Society of St. Columban. He established Preda, People Recovery Empowerment Development Assistance Foundation, in 1974. He has been working to emancipate women and children from sex slavery and promoting human rights, peace, and non-violence in the Philippines since being ordained and leaving Ireland in 1969. Father Shay has fought corruption and efforts for him to be deported in the 1980s when exposing in the media corruption and sexual exploitation of children as young as 9 in the sex industry that catered to the US soldiers stationed at the naval base in nearby Subic Bay. The base subsequently closed in 1992 after 9 years of campaigning. Based in Olongapo City, he continues to bring sexual perpetrators to justice while also speaking to governments around the world to lobby for laws to prevent sex tourism, sex trafficking, and child pornography. He continues to write weekly columns for the Manila Times and other publications. Father Shay has written an autobiography, Power and Passion, as well as the recent novel, Ricky and Julie. In addition to receiving a number of international humanitarian awards, both he and Preda have been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize on 4 occasions. In addition, I'm very fortunate to be able to call Father Shay my uncle, being my mother's brother. Francis Bermedo Jr. started his work at Preda Foundation in 2001 as a researcher. He headed the Special Human Rights Education Share project of Preda from 2004 to 2006. From 2006 to 2012, Francis headed Preda's Center for Children in Conflict with the Law and Children at Risk. Through the center, Preda has rescued hundreds of boys from subhuman conditions in jails and police detention centers. In 2012, Francis was appointed to the Board of Trustees as Executive Director of Preda, a position he held until 2019. After a short time as Preda's Vice President, he became President in December 2020. Francis is also Preda's permanent representative to the Juvenile Justice and Welfare Council, both at the national and regional levels.
Welcome to the Preda Foundation. I'm Father Shay Cullen. I founded the Preda in 1974, and this little historical background will give you some information about the work that we're doing today in the Philippines and how we began many years ago in 1974. So I hope you will enjoy this presentation. I started this foundation in 1974 here in Olongapo City. We're based at Subic Bay, and Subic Bay is on the Philippine Western Sea. Actually, this is in the news these days because the China is trying to claim all the Western Philippine Sea, and they've set up military bases just off the coast. And it's a big area of contention. The United States actually captured the Philippines from Spain in 1898, defeated the Filipinos in a war of independence, and by 1999 it established military stations at Subic Bay and at Clark Air Base in Pampanga, and smaller bases throughout the Philippines. So Subic Bay is a very important strategic location. It's a deep bay, excellent harbor, and the U.S. Navy established its first base right here on the edge of the Subic rainforest in 1989. That's a year after they occupied the Philippines. So the United States only gave up control of the Philippines in 1946. When the Republic of the Philippines was established. However, it maintained the military bases and economic power. So this was the beginning of our problems in the Philippines, because Preda was established in Olongapo City, which is just outside the military base. And I set it up in 1974, as I said, to address the very serious social problems that was being ignored by the Olongapo City government. They really encouraged the sex industry. They gave permits and licenses to really every establishment, hundreds of brothels and sex bars and clubs and sex parades throughout the city. It was just one big brothel, and it had very serious effects on the lives of the people. I set up the foundation, a very simple home, really for young people and youths that were dependent on drugs. And we turned to advocacy and challenged the government and their policy for allowing and promoting the sex industry, which brought about all these social evils, such as drug abuse, broken homes, HIV, AIDS, venereal disease, teenage pregnancies, and human trafficking, sex slavery, and child sexual abuse, among many of these problems we had to address. So this was where the U.S. Navy brought the 7th Fleet. Thousands of sailors came in, coming from the Vietnam War. And we have these social evils on the streets, where many of the children were, brought up in expecting that their only future in their life would be to be a sex worker. The sailors had free run, and we started exposing child sexual abuse in 1982. I uncovered human trafficking and child sex abuse syndicate that were supplying children to U.S. Servicemen. So there was 18 children we identified that they were positive for venereal disease in a charity clinic The youngest was 9 years old. So I had to expose all that in the media. We had to bring it out, and it became an international revelation. And there was only one U.S. officer was arrested and charged and flown out of the Philippines and put on trial in Guam. And after a long trial, he only received a very light sentence, as to be expected. But we had to suffer a lot of negative effects because of that revelation. I was charged with many crimes of destroying the economy of the city, and I started a campaign to challenge the existence of the U.S. bases, since they were the root cause of all the exploitation of the Filipino women and children. So I proposed a campaign to close the military bases and convert them into industrial zones to provide work with dignity and to close the sex industry. So we continued to expose human trafficking throughout the years. The children that were rescued were very, very young. The youngest was 9 years old, and they were not really taken care of in a proper way by the government, and they were not put in our care. So the work went on over the years. We continued to challenge the system, to challenge this exploitation of women and children, and the basis campaign began to pick up steam. And in 1992, after the ouster of the dictator President Marcos, which was in 1986, our campaign had become quite national, and we have an anti-basis coalition of NGOs and churches, and progressive politicians joined us. The Philippine Senate finally listened to all our cries for justice, and we pressured on them not to renew the agreement with the United States for the retention of the US bases. And they had to, finally, they closed down the bases, and it was a very, very big victory, and the plan to have them converted into a civilian use and setting up of business and bringing in investments and factories and all of that was very successful. However, we did say goodbye to the US Navy on November the 22nd, 1992, and this was something that left behind a residue of human suffering. Sadly, many children were left behind from the mothers of the Phil-Am children. So we took a court case in Washington, D.C. To demand justice for these children and their mothers. This was, of course, a case that was taken in the U.S. Court of International Settlement. The court improperly and wrongly ruled that the women were essentially prostitutes, and that that was an illegal action, and no settlement could be made over something that was an illegal relationship. So, in fact, the relationship was that of a common law wife in most cases. So we wanted to put right that injustice, and so we went to the U.S. Congress, and we talked to the Women's Caucus, and they took our side, and they agreed that the women and children had rights, and they ordered the USAID to give them help and aid. The USA just gave them a miserable $600,000 in educational systems, and they left it at that. So we didn't really win such a great victory, and that money was not given to Preda. Of course, it was given to a US-based NGO called the Preda Foundation. So human poverty and people living in dire conditions continued, and so we began our extra social services helping to rescue many children who were abused, who were put in the jails, they were locked up in youth detention centers. In 1988, we started a residential home in Olongapo for street children. And in 1996, Preda opened the first therapeutic home for sexually exploited and abused girls. Because the government was doing very little or anything to really help these victims, and child abuse had really spread throughout the community because of the bad example of the military base. So even though the base was converted now to industrial use, the communities had been so damaged that many of men began to abuse their own children. And this child sexual abuse began to spread throughout the Philippines as a result of this. So we continued to expand our services to try and deal with this, and we campaigned different to try and stop the pedophilia and to stop the spread of the child sexual abuse. So we campaigned for extraterritorial laws in other countries so that the police there might get their pedophiles. Many thousands were coming here to the Philippines, abusing our children, escaping back to their own countries in the UK, in Germany, in Australia, and the US. So we really campaigned for laws that they could be arrested in their own country and brought to justice. We did have one successful case in Germany where we brought children who testify, and we did win a conviction there. So our work continued, and we believe that the whole communities now were in some way seriously damaged because of the military bases there for 50 years. And so we began a community-based preventive education program for parents, students, teachers, community leaders. We really had to change the whole mentality for the respect and dignity of women and children, which had been so damaged over the many, many years. They were treated so badly. Little children were being put in jails, like this Rosie, locked behind bars, like criminals with other street children. The whole respect for children's rights was just not there anymore. By the year 2000, we expanded the home for girls and started legal actions against abusers. And we began winning convictions in the courts because hopefully, and our awareness campaign was really affecting the government and the judicial system. So they began convicting, began to see that the sexual abuse of children and was a terrible crime and damaged the whole nation. But then the street boys were also in dire straits. So 2003, we inaugurated a home for boys that were in conflict with the law. So these were kids put in the jails. We tried to stop them being convicted as criminals at an early age. Even 10-year-olds, or like Rosie, she's only 6 years old, put behind bars and no laws to protect her. So we lobbied and helped to write the Juvenile Justice Welfare Bill. And this would give the children no criminal liability if they were 15 years old and younger. And eventually, after many, many years of campaigning and lobbying, that law was finally passed with great success. And we are still implementing that. However, we're sad to say that the government does not really follow the law, and they lock up children in jail-like conditions. So we had to campaign against this terrible practice, which is sad to say still going on in many, many cities where they do not have homes for children. In 2005, we decided to try to get more media attention on this problem of the children in conflict with the law. And we participated in a major media expose, and we worked closely with ITV and CNN. And actually had a big impact in the Philippines. The people all over the world began campaigning, and so the law to protect children was passed. So the juvenile justice welfare law was finally passed. But sad to say, the government is very reluctant. I did go to the US Congress to plead with assistance from the US Department of Human Rights to do something and put pressure on the Philippine government to release children from these jails. And it did work. They separated the children from the adult criminals. But however, I had to go back again in 2015 and testify again to explain that actually the laws that were passed were not very effective. They are not releasing the children. So what I decided to do was to intensify our work at rescuing the children from these jails and expanding the home, so we could give an example of what a children's home really should be, you know. And we began releasing many of the children from the jail and bringing them. We campaigned, continued our campaign for the government to make proper homes for the children. So this is a big effort that has been going on for many, many years. And we have to say that it is a success, that we have rescued hundreds of children and gave them a new training, education, and a better life at the moment. We have this very nice center in Castillejos. As you see there in the picture, it's like a hotel, but that is to really make a statement about the dignity and the human rights of these teenagers. And they're not criminals, and they have a chance for new life. So we have vocational training and non-formal education for all of them, and therapy as well, so they can have a better, much better life. So we also have a new home for girls. In 2013, we opened a very nice center for these children, 6 to 17-year-old girls, give them therapy, education. And there's about 60 to 70 every year girls recovering from human trafficking and sexual abuse in their families. So as I said earlier, the US military bases were the beginning of this terrible corruption of the Filipino family, whereby incest and crimes against children really exploded. And the victims of human trafficking, sex abuse, and the commercial sexual exploitation, I'm very sad to say, still goes on. And it's terrible because of the internet. And the internet is providing online sexual abuse of children, and foreign pedophiles from Canada, the US, all over Europe and Australia are buying sex shows committed by criminals using the internet. We have to give them all sorts of legal help, assistance, therapy, support, and education. So that is basically the program that we have for these children. And they do recover, and they go on to continue their education. We have aftercare, primal therapy, where they're able to cry out their heartaches and their troubles and relieve their anger and their hatred for their abusers, and then they are empowered. And that helps them to testify in the court. And we have succeeded in many ways of helping these children to recover and to have a much happier and a better life. So there is success, and we have this home now for these girls. And we say so far the work is continuing, and we have a very active Preda team of professional 46 employees, therapists and social workers and administrators making all this work. So thank you very much for listening, and that's all my story. Here we are at the Preda Foundation. This is the home for girls. These children have been victims of human trafficking. They were sex slaves outside in the power of pimps, and they were rescued and brought here to the children's home. Here they receive affirmation, welcome, and new start in life. So the children here are benefiting, they are developing their personality, their character, discovering their talents, their intelligence. They're studying, as you can see, in the modular system, and they participate in many activities of karate and of dancing and many other natural and very happy experiences. So this is a new life for them, beginning of hope for the future, that they can build a life full of joy and happiness and be recovered.
Lee, Son, She, Go, Look.
Tapos kliyente, pag sinabi kliyente, sigaw lang dahil hindi kayo magbibilang. Lahat ng sasabihin niya, sigaw lang. Okay? Kliyente!
Walking down the alleyways of misery and despair, filled with homeless orphans in a land that doesn't care. Hungry children, lonely poor, only dogs to lick their sores. No one should be silent, we'll batter down the doors.
Here at the Preda Foundation, all these children are happy. It's over one main thing. This is because the children experience the release of all the emotion, the pain, and the suffering through emotional release therapy. This enables them to fight back against their abuser. All that pain and hurt from abuse that is buried inside, it's released, and they're able to be free. We're going to show you some of this therapy. Don't be distressed. It's the children are shouting and crying, but it is great freedom for them. So let's watch. Hello everybody, welcome here to Preda Foundation. We're now with the children who are doing their studies, and we have one of the girls here and happy to talk with us. Kumusta ang buhay mo dito sa loob ng Preda? Kumusta ka?
Hello po, magandang umaga po sa inyo. Okay lang naman po kami dito. Masaya po, marami po kami natututunan. Meron po kami ditong more activities, nagko-cooking, baking, Preda values. Madami po kami natutunan dito, karate, pagsasayaw, magagandang asal po. Ganun.
Oh, maganda na naman na marami din na ginagawa dito sa Preda. At bago pumasok ka sa Preda, kumusta ang buhay mo sa labas?
Ano po, mahirap po kasi sa labas po hindi po namin naisip na pahalagaan yung pagkababae namin. Sa amin okay lang po na mabastos kami, basta lang po magkapera kami. Pero dito po nalaman namin lahat na dapat namin pahalagahan kung anong meron kami. Na hindi porke hindi kami mayaman, hindi na kami dapat irespeto. Yun po.
Okay, maganda naman. At ikaw din na may karanasan mo dito ng ibang therapy. Kumusta ang therapy mo yan?
Ano naman po, nakakatulong po ng sobra. Kasi na-process po lahat sa utak ko yung pagiging tama. Pati ano po, may primal po kami dito. Sa primal po, nalalabas po namin lahat ng galit namin. Nakakatulong po yun para hindi na po magpatong-patong yung sama ng loob namin. Nalalabas po namin lahat ng sama namin ng loob doon.
And then pagkatapos ng therapy session, anong pakiramdam mo?
Paano po, maginhawa, masarap po kasi parang natanggal po yung tinik sa dibdib namin. Yun lang.
Very good. So join us in this important work. We need the help and the support of everybody, and this is so important that we are working as a team. And so welcome to our Defender of Children's work. And this important project is, of course, giving life to those in greatest need. Thank you.
We're gonna change the world, so open up your hearts. Let's share the planet's wealth in 100 billion parts. We'll heal the ones who source and batter down the doors. We're gonna change the world, change the world. Yeah, 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 yeah. Walking down the alleyways of misery and despair, filled with homeless orphans in a land that doesn't care. Hungry children, lonely poor, only dogs to lick their sores. No one should be silent or batter down the doors.
Tours of apathy and difference of greed. Shout to all the planet, don't let the GMC.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Francis Bermido Jr. I'm the president of the People's Recovery, Empowerment, and Development Assistance, otherwise known as Preda Foundation, based in the Philippines. As you know, with the advent of cheap air travel, sex tourism was never really wiped out. Like the coronavirus, the problem has mutated and has moved into cyberspace. Most recent statistics from the Philippines will show that 8 out of 10 Filipino children suffer from some form of violence in their lifetime. 1 out of 4 Filipino women experience physical, emotional, or sexual violence in their lifetime. Annually, the Philippines records 700,000 cases of trafficking. From 2014 to 2017, the Philippines recorded a 250% increase in cases of online sexual abuse and exploitation. More recently, during the lockdown in 2020, 279,000 incidents of child abuse, or equivalent to 265% increase, was recorded from March 1 to May 24, 2020, or during the lockdown in the Philippines. The Preda Foundation opened a home for girls who are victims of abuse and exploitation in 1996. Since then, the Preda Foundation has helped more than 1,200 children, survivors of trafficking for commercial and online sexual purposes. Data from the Preda Project in 2020 presents a clear picture as to who are the main perpetrators of sexual abuse and exploitation of the children. It was revealed that for those categorized as sexually abused children, majority of them were abused by their stepfathers, followed by those victimized by their neighbors, biological fathers, uncles, peers, grandfathers, mothers, male cousins. There were also instances in which a village official, a teacher, and a pastor were separately charged. Of the commercially sexually exploited children, 43 victims brought charges against members of their peer group. As per Preda's experience, duty bearers are usually unaware of their responsibility to the children and do not know how or are not motivated to act in a manner that will uphold and protect the rights of children. So aside from the daily capacity building seminars and trainings, we give out brochures, pamphlets, posters, and stickers. As a result of these awareness-raising initiatives, complaints and reports of abuse and trafficking committed against children come to the knowledge of Preda and government social workers. These were then immediately acted upon. For raising awareness among children, the Preda team uses effective strategies such as puppet shows and video shows. There are times when the victims themselves approach the Preda staff to disclose about their ordeal. Sometimes they contact the Preda 24/7 hotline number. In some cases, a close friend, a relative, or even a concerned citizen will be the one to seek help from Preda on behalf of the victims. There are also good and active local government social workers who contact Preda whenever there are cases of trafficking or abuse that reach their office. In any of these instances, Preda social workers will immediately conduct a revalidation to confirm the report. From time to time, should there be reported cases of ongoing trafficking of children for commercial sexual exploitation, undercover investigations will be conducted in the sex parks to identify the minors. Once it has been confirmed that minors were trafficked and are working in the sex parks or cyber sex dens, the Preda social workers will coordinate with the authorities to effect the rescue of the minors and the arrest of the suspected traffickers and abusers. Immediately after the minors are rescued from abuse, they are placed in the protective custody of the Preda home, where their recovery starts right away. Upon arrival at Preda, the rescued children are welcomed by staff and children and provided all their basic needs, including emotional support and encouragement. The child is welcomed by a group of residents already settled in the home and is assigned to a caring and professional social worker who would handle her case. If a medical legal exam is not yet done, she will be brought to a government medical legal officer within the first 24 hours of admission. The Preda social worker immediately conducts the intake interview, then starts building the child's comprehensive social case study report, complete with a child-specific intervention plan. The academic development of these children does not stop when they are admitted into the Preda home. The children who are eligible to be enrolled in a formal school are assisted to be officially admitted into formal schooling. But due to COVID, however, these children are doing modular classes. Some of these children were not able to meet the demands of formal schooling as they are not yet emotionally ready. Nevertheless, their learning was supplemented by the project staff through non-formal education lessons at the center. The older girls supported by this project, especially those who were rescued from the sex industry, are provided with various skills that may help them earn a decent living. They are assisted to acquire vocational in-demand skills on bread and pastry making, cooking and sewing. Welding, electrical repair, and driving lessons are also available should the girls express interest to join them. The emotional expression therapy, uniquely developed by Preda, allows the child victims to freely express their pain and anger. This contributes to the empowerment and confidence building among the victims. It allows the victims to freely express their buried pain and anger by crying and shouting at their trafficker and abusers in a padded therapy room. With counseling and support from the Preda-trained psychotherapists, the victims are able to cope, become emotionally free and stable, and capable to speak with conviction and credibility. As they are empowered, some would want to speak in public and through media, to encourage other silent victims to speak out and come forward for help. The project believes that recovery for victims is not complete if justice is not served, thus providing legal assistance to pursue cases against abusers and traffickers is a core service offered by the program. It involves gathering of evidence and testimonies from the victims and witnesses, conducting children's court for mock trials, locating other witnesses and persuading them to take a stand with the child, preparing pleadings to the court, escorting child victims and attending court hearings. The project relies on government-trained public prosecutors specializing in trafficking cases. Preda has its own paralegal social workers to assist victims. In 2018 alone, despite bureaucratic delays and a complicated justice system in the Philippines, the children in Preda's care won a total of 18 court cases against their abusers and exploiters. Almost all got life sentences in prison. In 2019, the project surpassed its previous accomplishment with 20 convictions. In 2020, there were 17 convictions of child abusers and traffickers. It is very important to provide all the necessary help to victims of trafficking and sexual exploitation so they can rebuild their lives. At the Preda Therapeutic Home for Girls, the children are safe from their abusers and they receive comprehensive and integrated direct services. Other therapeutic interventions include psychosocial interventions such as group therapy and counseling. Aside from strengthening the mind, it is also important to strengthen the body and foster discipline. Thus, at Preda, there is regular sports activities, karate, dance, and music lessons. So what happens when the children recover? When the children have recovered at the Preda home, and when there is no more threat to her safety in the community, she is reintegrated to her nearest supportive family or relative and continue to receive aftercare services for the next 18 months to sustain progress. Aside from the regular monthly educational support to reintegrated clients, they also undergo psychosocial interventions and trainings online on how to protect themselves. They are monitored weekly by the Preda Aftercare social worker. Their parents and guardians too are also capacitated. Series of interventions such as rights-based seminars and parental capability trainings, family counseling, dialogue, reconciliation are implemented online to capacitate and prepare the family for the task of providing rights-based care to their child and to ensure that the child will no longer re-experience such abuse and exploitation. So now let's listen to some of the children helped by Preda tell their stories while living in the Preda Therapeutic Home.
Hello everybody and welcome here to the Preda Foundation. We are now in the home for girls and the children are here doing their modules, they're studying, and we have one of our girls here to tell us a little about her life outside and then here in Preda. Good morning. Can you tell us a little about your how you're feeling here, what you're doing now in Preda? Anong gusto mo sabihin sa mga tao tungkol sa ginagawa niyo dito sa Preda?
Ano po, maganda po dito sa Preda, masaya po kasi po madami po kami natutunan dito.
At saka anong ibang activities na nagkaranasan mo dito? Yung kanina?
Karate po, sayaw, para ano po, mga activity po namin, mga baking po, cooking. Masaya naman po.
At meron kang dinong ibang hirapan mo dun sa labas bago pumasok sa Preda. Kumusta ang buhay mo dyan sa labas?
Ano po, mahirap din po. Ano, tinatapakan dito yung pagkatao namin.
Okay, at dito na meron kang ibang chance sa therapy. Anong therapy na Parang lalabasan yung pakiramdam. Anong tawag yun?
Ano po, masaya kasi pakiramdam.
Yun yung primal therapy. Kumusta din yun?
Okay lang naman po.
Anong pakiramdam mo dun sa primal therapy?
Masakit po. Nalulungkot. Lagi. Tapos, ano po.
Kinalabas mo ang ang feelings mo?
Ano nga po?
Oh, ano yan ang lalabas mo?
Ano po, yung pagkamis ko po sa mga family ko. Ano po.
Okay. So, thank you very much. Masaya ka dito sa Preda?
Masaya naman po.
Okay, sige. Maganda na. Tuloy din sa pag-aaral mo at every success. Thank you. Magandang umaga sa iyo at meron din tayo sa Preda Foundation at gusto talaga na alaman na kumusta ang buhay mo dito sa Preda? Anong ginagawa niyo?
Okay lang naman po. Sa ngayon po, nagmo-module po kami. Na kahit po mahirap yung module namin, tinuturuan po kami ng mga staff or social worker namin para po masagutan namin yung mga module namin.
Kumusta dati nung yung buhay sa labas, no? Mahirap ba?
Opo, mahirap. Kasi po, natatapakan po yung pagkatao namin.
And then, kung mag-rescue na kayo at padala dito sa Preda, kumusta yung pagbabago sa isip mo?
Nagbago na po yung pagtakbo ng utak ko na dapat hindi ko po ginagamit yung sarili ko para magkaroon po ako ng pera. At pinapahalagahan ko yung dignidad ko. At dapat alam ko yung mga values. Kaya yun po, nung nadala pa ako dito sa Preda, natuto po ako ng mga magagandang asal.
Very good. Maraming salamat. Thank you so much. Very good.
We can all do something to stop child abuse and exploitation. Online sexual abuse and exploitation of children is both a transnational and a national crime. Perpetrators, mostly from developed countries like Germany and Canada, victimize children in poor countries like the Philippines. But it is highly likely that they move on to actually abuse and exploit children wherever they are. Internet service providers must install effective program or software that ensures access to or transmittal of any form of child pornography will be blocked or filtered. More importantly, it should lead to the rescue of victims and their placement into care where they can receive psychosocial services. Thank you for listening and good day.
Hello again. I want to speak to you now about the involvement of the Preda Foundation in helping to propose and draft certain laws on the anti-human trafficking and the child protection of children. In the 1980s, there was really no law in the Philippines protecting children from sexual abuse. The Penal Code had acts of lasciviousness as a crime, which was so vague that there were hardly any prosecutions and convictions. There was another law, a presidential decree 603, but that was not very effective in prosecuting child sexual abusers or rapists. In fact, it was only in around the 1980s when we began to form a coalition together to combat the sex tourism and the abuse of children. This was called ECPAT, End Child Prostitution and Trafficking. For this organization, they became very conscious of the lack of prosecutions and convictions of sex tourists. So they proposed a law in the country from where many of the offenders came. And this extraterritorial jurisdiction law became, you might say, the flavor of the time because since we could not prosecute non-Filipino abusers here, the idea was that the countries from where they came would prosecute them when they escaped from the Philippines, and provided we were able to provide the evidence. However, that needed to be promoted. So I was invited by ECPAT offices in Japan, Germany, in Australia, in New Zealand, and the United States to go around and develop the laws, promote them, and giving press interviews, TV talk shows, and everything. And finally, these laws were passed in some of these countries. In fact, in one case in Germany, we did bring a case there and brought child victims to Germany under this law of extraterritorial jurisdiction, and we found the abuser, and he went on trial, and we did win a conviction. It was then only a small punishment of 2.5 years. He abused his child in the Philippines. However, today in 2021, a new law has passed in Germany, making 15 years the maximum sentence for child sexual abuse for children abused abroad. Another issue then that we developed was in the Philippines. We really needed a law here. So we lobbied and drafted and promoted a new law that eventually was called Republic Act 7610. And this was quite comprehensive and really tried to cover every possible aspect of child sexual abuse. However, it did not cover the fact that the age of consent of child sexual abuse in the Philippines is 12 years old. So we are now lobbying hard in the Senate at this very time for the passage of a law which will raise the age of consent for a minor to 16 years old. And that means that any child who is abused 16 years old or younger, it will be statutory rape. And that is quite a very serious crime in the Philippines. And in fact, in most of these laws, the punishment is really up to 17 years to life imprisonment. So the laws are quite strict. Then at this time, I was going to Ireland, and I was trying to promote the rights of the child. Actually, way back in 1989, I was a delegate in Helsinki for the drafting and the writing of the UN Convention for the Rights of the Child. And that was passed in the following year. So from the very beginning, we've been very active in trying to promote laws. So every country is supposed to work on the Convention of the Rights of the Child of the UN, so that they would make their own laws. So in Ireland, they had no law against child pornography. So I promoted this law. I went to Dublin and had press conferences in Boswell's Hotel. We have some lawyers with us. We have Senator Henry, and we have a member of parliament promoting it, Owen Ryan. And we found a receptive government who was willing to make this law. Finally, in 2 years later, this law was passed. So in Ireland, we were able to pass this law in 1998, and it was quite progressive law in that time, and it was taking virtual realities, and the depiction of children being sexually abused, like an avatar. So then, it was very difficult. We also continued to, this law in Ireland was passed successfully, and so We continued in 2009. I began to lobby and help to draft a law together with Senator Jambi Madrigal on anti-child pornography law here in the Philippines. And we were proposed for that law, and it was included, was that all of the telecommunications corporations, the ISPs, that they should be bound by law to install anti-child pornography software on all of their servers. However, it's quite controversial because since 2009, they have not done this. They have chosen to pay a small fine. Apparently, the law was a bit manipulated to give them an exit door. And that was to spend money for a small fine every year if they did not comply. So that's been going on for years. Now we are lobbying at the moment in the media and challenging the telecommunications corporations to obey the law and challenging government to implement it. So they're making a lot of excuses and creating confusion that the law is contradictory and so on. So they really don't want to implement this blocking software that is available. Microsoft DNA photo and DNA video is very effective. It's using AI, to be able to detect child sexual abuse on the internet. It's pretty good. And so that was the main things that we did. In more recent years, we have another work. We were working actively with the government agencies from the embassies who are implementing the extraterritorial jurisdiction law, like in Australia and in the United States. They have federal police here in Manila, and now the German embassy has just received a new police officer who will hopefully investigate German pedophiles and traffickers who are abusing children here in the Philippines. So finally, our last more recent legal action to bring about new laws was in Ireland. We've helped with the representative in the parliament, Maureen O'Sullivan, and she filed a complaint which mimicked a law in Australia whereby convicted pedophiles should not be allowed to leave the country and take trips to foreign countries like the Philippines, where children are very vulnerable. However, under EU law of universal travel, I don't think that's going to be very successful. Although they were able to introduce lots of laws that restricted the travel of people during the lockdowns, and during the coronavirus, they had no problem in restricting the travel of possible spreaders of the virus. However, the sexual abuse of the children is a worse virus than it's an act of terrorism, you might say. And those who are convicted of such crimes, they should be restricted in their travel to the Philippines. But we go on every day. We are implementing the Philippine laws against human trafficking and sexual abuse of children. We are having hearings nearly every day. The children are empowered through our emotional release therapy. We call it primal therapy, in fact. And they become quite articulate and quite open and clear, and that's why we win a lot of convictions. An average every year of 15 to 18 cases and convictions we win every year. So we all have to stand together and work for the implementing and improving laws everywhere to protect children. So thank you for being with us.
And that concludes our webinar piece of this portion today. coming up, though, we do have Kate Quinn joining us. But as I'm sure you could see, that was a pre-recorded webinar that the Preda Foundation did do specifically for this webinar today. In regards to any questions that you may have in relation to their presentation, you can put them in the Q&A box, and we will get them to the Preda Foundation and post the answers on our website in the upcoming weeks. Along with that will be a copy of the webinar. As we move to the next part, we are proud to introduce Kate Quinn to bring a Canadian and local context to this webinar and this very important topic and conversation today. It's not to go unnoticed that this issue is occurring right where we live. So we are privileged to have Kate join us. Kate Quinn serves as the Executive Director for CEASE, which is the Center to End All Sexual Exploitation, and the co-chair of the Sexual Exploitation Working Group. The working group is a leadership group in Edmonton and has organized an annual week of awareness since 2004. They also provide learning opportunities throughout the year. So Kate, I will turn it over to you. And if anybody has any questions questions for us, if you put it in the Q&A box, we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we possibly can today. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather and Peter and Holly and Allies for Youth and all who are working to create protection and opportunities for children and young people in Alberta. It's a real honor to be part of this webinar. And I want to begin by just recognizing that I heard a lot of similar threads. I heard that, in the pandemic, there's been an increase in internet child exploitation in Alberta, an increase in domestic violence. I heard that the need for awareness, advocacy, laws to protect, increased services, safe homes, the need to recognize and heal intergenerational trauma, and to continue to advocate to respect children's rights. Our struggles are the same in Alberta as they are in the Philippines, though they may look differently. And I would like to just share a brief historical picture that roots me in this presentation. And that is, as a young woman and then a young mother in the late 70s and 80s, I worked for a national organization called Development and Peace. And my work was to travel throughout Alberta and raise awareness among Albertans about social justice struggles in countries such as the Philippines, Central America, South Africa, and many others, and to mobilize solidarity responses. So during that time, I would like to honor the work of Father Shay Cullen, because I believe that was really the first time when I learned about prostitution, sexual exploitation, and sex trafficking, human trafficking in all its forms. I knew the name Olongapo. We mobilized Albertans to be aware of what the US servicemen were doing to children and women in the Philippines, and that whole struggle and the work of ECPAT. And why that's important is because learning from people and the struggles in the global South, I really learned about the root causes, whether it's dire poverty, social injustice, economic injustice, racial injustice, and gender inequality. And so in the late 80s in Edmonton, when the issues of sexual exploitation literally erupted into the midst of people in core communities in Edmonton, we had a really solid framework. We knew we had to address this from a social justice perspective, an economic justice perspective, and all of this in work. At the time in Edmonton, there was sexual exploitation and sex trafficking of children. We just didn't know it. The community was asleep. The only response in Edmonton at that time in 1986 was Catholic Social Services Safe House. Later in 1999, E4C began a walking outreach to try to reach people. And then communities got involved because there was such an intense traffic of men circulating core communities. harassing children on their way to school, harassing women on their way to work, and exploiting highly vulnerable children. So I just think this is important to remember. In 1992, the Edmonton Police Service did an actual count, and we had the police identified 250 children under the age of 18 who were being visibly exploited in the communities in Edmonton's city center area, and over 750 between the ages of 18 and 30 and up. The sad stat today is that of the reported human trafficking cases that we know, and there's many that are hidden, 45% are between 18 and 24, and 28% are under 18. So we still have a real challenge around creating a healthy and protective society for children and youth. What's really key is that the work to bring about justice and protection, I find, goes in waves and different movements. So in the 90s, at that time, and it echoed something that Father Cullen said, we did not have laws that protected children. We arrested children and labeled them as prostitutes, child prostitutes. And I know a woman who still carries the weight of a criminal charge from those days in the early 90s. But what did our community do? We mobilized. So that was neighborhood residents, parents whose daughters were exploited, women themselves who had been exploited as teenagers, law enforcement, Crown prosecutors. We mobilized to do something different, and we worked with our politicians. We had a task force, it was called on child prostitution, that then resulted in the creation of laws and services, safe houses, outreach workers, children's services workers. That was first called the protection of children involved in prostitution, but then we began a shift to understand it wasn't children choosing, it was children being exploited. And our legislation is now called Protection of Sexually Exploited Children. We began to shift the weight and the responsibility away from the shoulders of children and youth onto the causes of the exploitation and those who perpetrate against children. So all this was the movement of the 90s. And out of that did become a lot of energy and a lot of really great work. Then we moved into the 2000s, and then that was when the intensification of women murdered and missing began in our communities. It had always happened before, but there was intense times. So that mobilized us and moved us forward. In the 2000s as well, this is when Canada signed the Palermo Protocol. And when you sign on a protocol, you have to create laws and services. So we are in the process of doing that over the last 15 years. I want to say that we have some really strong things happening, but we always need to keep the pressure on, keep the advocacy on. I'm going to give one quick example because Father Cullen talked about the laws around prosecuting Canadian men who go to countries like the Philippines or Thailand or anywhere else and exploit children. We have had a law since 1997. The latest stats that I found were 2008, and 146 men had been charged, but only one convicted. In Alberta, we actually had a charge in 2015 of a man who exploited a young girl in Ireland. I don't know where that is in the courts now, but it shows you that we have laws, but we have to always keep the awareness, the perseverance, and the pressure to make sure that protective laws are enforced. We're thankful that we have the Internet Child Exploitation Team. We're thankful that we now have child advocacy centers such as the Zebra Center. Very thankful that we have the PSECA and other, the PSECA program and services and other services for youth. That's the work of the Allies for Youth, and we're so thankful we have all that. But it shows that it takes, in every decade, we have to have awareness, mobilization. We have to be looking at the root causes and addressing that, because there's always new challenges. So I want us to remember something else, another part of the story. And this too was part of our Edmonton story. As a community in the late 80s and early 90s, when we were gathering with this multi-stakeholder group, we did an analysis and we asked ourselves, what activities cause the most harm to the most people? It's easy to focus on the child or woman standing on the street, or now it'd be advertising on the internet, but who is behind? And we saw there were two shadow figures. One could be labeled as pimps or traffickers or perpetrators, but the other, the driver is those men, primarily men, who abuse and solicit sex services from children and women. And that drives trafficking. Trafficking is a business that needs money to profit. And so you have to have a demand for services. That drives it. So our community named that it was the activities of men cruising our neighborhoods, affecting all of us. Little girls could not get to Sacred Heart and Macaulay schools or Eastwood, Norwood schools safely. And we had named then that there were 250 vulnerable children on the street corners. And as a community, we said, we have to do two things. We have to not only care about the children who live in our own homes, but the children who are on the street and in the shadows and in the margins. And we think one of the best ways we can do that is to focus on the men who are cruising and harassing and exploiting. So out of that, we created what we now call the Sex Trade Offender Program. It'll be 25 years, May the 26th, since we began this program of educating and raising awareness and building empathy among men to, to see the effects of their actions on children, adults, and communities. The key thing to remember, though, is that if a man is trying to solicit sex services from children, they're not eligible. It's only if you're soliciting over 18, because with our Protection of Sexually Exploited Children Act, we take the abuse of children very seriously. I think it's really critical to remember too that when Canada signed on to the Palermo Protocol, the protocol states that countries must adopt or strengthen legislative or other means such as educational, social, or cultural measures to discourage the demand that fosters all forms of exploitation of persons, especially women and children, that leads to trafficking. We need to do more in Canada, and it does need to be more than just laws. It does have to be an educational, social, and cultural shift. We have to focus on a culture of respect, just as that plea from Shay Cullen about the rights of children and the rights of young people. And we have to lead this, and we have to talk about how do we heal what has gone so wrong in our society, that some people in our society harm children and young people so deeply. Where are we breaking down around fostering healthy relationships, helping our children and young people and ourselves navigate a sexualized consumer society? And where do we talk about the root causes, the poverty, the economic injustice, the social injustice? We have to have these conversations in the framework of justice and in the framework of healing. And that's how we're going to turn this around. So we're in another movement phase, and I'm really happy about that because we in the 90s, we mobilized, we created laws and services and more safe houses, and we got busy working and implementing. Then there were more women who were murdered and missing. We had mobilized in another way. In the 2000s and the where we are now, we now have a provincial human trafficking task force. We have a couple of facilitative organizations like Reach Edmonton, Not in My City, Act Alberta. We have many who are on the ground doing the good work in the communities, but we need to move our society forward. or we will always be involved in, in helping and creating more safe houses. We have to change what is causing the harm. So I think I'm going to stop there at that point. There's many good things now. National hotline, our 211 in Alberta knows how to respond if someone calls them about human trafficking. We have the Canadian Centre for Child Protection that is really leading a lot of the work on reporting and pushing for legislation on child sexual abuse materials. We do have an Alberta politician who is working to challenge what the reporting functions on internet platforms, as we heard Shay Cullen talking about at the end. We do have victim supports through our Justice and Solicitor General, and we have many good things, but we've got a lot of work to do, and I'd love to hear what your comments and questions are. Thank you.
I was muted. Had to happen once on a Zoom session, didn't it, to somebody? Thank you so much, Kate, for bringing that perspective here to round out this webinar today, and the importance of those conversations and of moving this important topic forward. So we really appreciate what you're bringing forward. We do have some poll questions as well. I haven't seen any questions pop up yet, but if people do have some, please bring them forward, and we can bring them forward to Kate maybe as well, and just try to get some of your answers for you. As we know, this is a very heavy topic, and as such, sometimes the questions come a little bit later. So we do appreciate that. So yes, we are going to have some poll questions come up. So we would ask that you take a couple of minutes to complete the polls, and I am going to turn it over to Peter here quickly. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather, and thanks so much for being part of this, Kate. And I hope you got a lot out of the webinar today. We certainly encourage you all to carry on this conversation and share what you learned today with others as a way to support what this Sexual Exploitation Week of Awareness is all about. Perhaps this can lead to, as Kate was discussing, and Father Shay as well, can lead to stronger laws in Canada, or even motivating the government to actually enact the laws on a stronger basis. And so there can be more protection for children and youth and women, including those in the LGBTQ2S+ community, that they can live without the threat of being sexually exploited and trafficked or being trapped in the sex tourism industry. And we know the damage it can do, the lifelong consequences of anybody that's exploited, particularly with the younger children and their vulnerability with their brain development and the consequences of that. We know that there are a number of groups, again, as Kate had discussed too, but dedicated to stopping these crimes and fighting for justice, including the Human Trafficking Task Force, CEASE, of course, the Action Coalition on Human Trafficking, the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton, the Protection of Sexually Exploited Children program through Children's Services, and the Zebra Child Protection Center, and others in different parts of the province as well. If you require help to get support for somebody you believe is being sexually exploited and or trafficked, these organizations can help. The contact information can be found on the poster for this event and on the webinar tab of the Allies for Youth Connections Conference website.
Thank you. Kate, we do have a couple of questions before we move to the next. Do you believe that systemic racism in a Canadian context has had an impact on child exploitation?
Yes, I do. I won't take time to expound, but yes, I do. And I think, again, Shay Cullen illustrated the long-term impact of the American colonization, we could say, in the Philippines, and then the impact of intergenerational trauma. We live the same experience here in Canada. And we do know that many Indigenous children and young people are preyed upon. So yes.
Thank you. We do have another couple of questions here popping up. How involved are the police in this issue? I know in Vancouver, they have designated police who educate and act on reports of trafficking as they came to educate a group of social workers working in one of our hospitals.
If I could respond to that, and I'm seeing a couple others that might want questions along the same line.
Yeah.
So in Alberta, we have shifted from municipal police forces, especially Calgary and Edmonton, having their own human trafficking and counter-exploitation units. We now have the Alert Human Trafficking Counter-Exploitation Unit, organized both a north and a south. And I know they are, well connected to the protection of sexually exploited children, units throughout the province as well. There's a question here about Project CARE. Project CARE does not exist any longer. It was the RCMP response to those, to the murders and missing women in Alberta in the 2000s. The CARE unit has now been integrated into the Alert unit. So there's an RCMP officer along with Edmonton Police Service. And the work of CARE has now in the historical homicides and missing persons unit in both RCMP and EPS. So that's a quick response there. I don't think they'll be bringing back this position. I think what we will see is an expansion of the work of Alert throughout the province. And there's a couple of exciting newly funded projects, which, with police and community together, that I think will in a sense, address these challenges in new ways.
Awesome, thank you. One of the people asked, how does one get involved in this work around Edmonton in supporting this important cause? So.
Well, I could do a quick response, and then maybe Peter or Holly would like to add in. I think it's always important to begin with awareness, taking the time to learn and to listen. And there are several free online training programs about human trafficking, both through Not in My City as well as through ACT Alberta. And so start there, listen and learn. Then there can be ways, some of us are called to really volunteer and work directly with persons. And I always suggest people, connect with some of the bigger organizations that have great volunteer training programs and opportunities. So for example, Catholic Social Services. That's an opportunity where you could potentially volunteer, take some training, and meet all the requirements, because you'd be interacting with vulnerable young people. But there's opportunities there. Some like to be in leadership, so that's really important. Every charity, nonprofit needs board members and people who will help with public awareness for those organizations. So you have to look at yourself. What calls you to this? What are you willing to give? What are you willing to learn? And how then can you connect?
Yeah, and just echoing that too. But I mean, just having conversations with people. I don't know how many people are aware that Canada has had the finger pointed to it, because there are people that engage in sex tourism and go to these countries. I mean, we know there's local problems as well, but Canadians are leaving the country to go to others and exploit children. And just educating people around that this is a thing, sex tourism is a thing. And there may be convicted pedophiles that are still leaving the country to exploit children in other countries. And just having those conversations, and how do we start addressing this? How do we appeal to our MPs or MLAs about, we have this law, but why isn't it, why are we getting one conviction out of 250? How can we strengthen the laws and start those discussions? As Father Shay had said, a lot of the success they've had in getting laws enacted in the Philippines and in other places have been because a conversation was brought to people and created an awareness and then a demand to do something about it, which we just continue to need to do.
I forgot to say that, so thanks, Peter. The other thing that each one of us can do is to write to our MLAs and to write to our members of parliament. You can follow the news. I do know this one MP from Alberta who wants to bring a new law forward around child pornography and MindGeek and internet exploitation. So perhaps A4Y and SUG, we could put together a list of, key pressure points that politicians might need to hear about at this time. We can also be looking for the recommendations that will be coming from the Alberta Human Trafficking Task Force. And again, wherever we live in Alberta, say to your MLA, I really think these recommendations are important. As a taxpayer, I'd like to see some more money put into protective services or transitional programs. Use your voice wherever you can. That's really important as well.
Absolutely, and there's strength in numbers. So the more people we can have take on even the smallest role, that adds to the whole. So thank you for sharing that, Kate and Peter, and just how do we keep moving this forward? Oh, Kate has something else. Awesome.
Well, one more thing, because I think a person sent me a question in the chat, but I just replied to the panelists. And the question was around 211. So right now, what I'm really proud to say is Not in My City facilitative organization really worked with 211 and invested monies in training. So Alberta 211 responders are well versed and know how to connect people. I can't speak for the 211s across the country, but maybe Alberta has set an example and that will follow. I can say that the National Human Trafficking Hotline is a really great resource. It is part of Canada's commitment to having signed onto the Palermo Protocol and developing a national action plan on human trafficking. They provide responses in over 30 languages, and I can tell you that last week we picked up a call at CEASE from the trafficking hotline that patched an Edmonton woman through to a local resource. In this case, it was CEASE. So that network is building across the country, and it's really important. And again, a good use of our taxpayer money to create that national hotline. And then that hotline does connect with 211. So often people don't know who to call. Well, now you can start with 211, or if you think somebody's in trouble, call 211, or the child, there's a child protection number as well. The Northern Alberta Child Intervention Services, or Southern Alberta, there's the police non-emergency line, there's the police 911. And I think we need to strengthen our responses, but we've taken some positive steps.
Awesome. I got one more question here, just quickly, that just came forward. Do you believe that we need to have specialized courts, judges, and crowns? And would that be of a benefit?
For what purpose?
For, I would think, it doesn't say there, but maybe for the prosecution of perpetrators of this. Yes.
And commercial child sexual abuse. I think that we could benefit from more specialized training of judges and support for prosecutors. We work with some really great prosecutors who are well versed, but there's always new prosecutors coming on. So I think we might want to take a step and look at the whole criminal justice system, and both training, awareness, education. It may end up in a specialized court. I know some places in the United States have specialized human trafficking courts. I don't feel I have the full answer on that to advocate, but I think we need to look and work with our criminal justice system partners.
Thank you. All right. I don't see any further questions. So I would just like to say a big thank you to all of you who attended today and being part of this webinar. And a big thank you to Father Shay and Francis Bermedo and Emmanuel Dewey from the Preda Foundation. And of course, yourself, Kate, for coming and joining us today. We're honored to have you here. A special thanks to Holly Hallborg and the Reach Edmonton team, Renee Sullivan from Catholic Social Services Safe House for all their work on making this happen. It wouldn't have happened without you. As well as Clayton Knoll from the Collaborative Media Group for taking care of all of our tech needs and guiding us through this because we need it. Our appreciation extends to the Sexual Exploitation Working Group and the Allies for Youth Connections Conference Organizing Committee. And once again to you who've attended here today, thank you for being part of this webinar. We appreciate you moving this important topic forward and bringing awareness. Please look forward to any future webinars. You can check out our website, our social media, and we look forward to our next conference, hopefully in person in May of 2022. So thank you all. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.